second ara, slightly more lumdish, and that is, so we had a machloikis between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, what the minimum share of a sukkah is. Beis Shammai says the minimum share of a sukkah has to be big enough where you can fit roishai, v'rubai, v'shulchana. Beis Hillel said the minimum share of a sukkah only has to be big enough for you to be able to fit roishai, v'rubai. And we said even though ordinarily when there's a machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, we paskin like Beis Hillel. This is one of 6 exceptions, like Tosfos brings in the name of Rav Amram. Over here, the halacha is not like Beis Hillel. Over here, the halacha is like Beis Shammai. The Bir Halacha in Siman Tov Reish Lamed Daled quotes a Prima Gadim. The Prima Gadim says that a sukkah has to be Zayin Tvachim al Zayin Tvachim, Kishitas Beis Shammai. The shear of Zayin Tvachim al Zayin Tvachim is halacha l'Moshe Misin. That's what the Prima Gadim says. At first glance, he's not saying such a big chiddush. The Gemara says in a bunch of places, it's coming up in a few dafin, that shiurim, chatzitzin, and mechitzin are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Shiurim are all halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So because shiurim are all halacha l'Moshe Misinai, it makes sense that the shear of a sukkah is also halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So the Prima Gadim at first glance not saying such a big chiddush. Prima Gadim said that the shear of a sukkah, zayin al zayin, is halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Oh, but the Bir Halacha is matmiya on this Prima Gadim. It says he doesn't understand how the Prima Gadim could possibly say that the shear of a sukkah is from the shiurim that are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. He says, why not? He says, because the Rambam says in Hilchas Mamrin Perek Aleph Halacha Gimel, this may sound familiar, Divrei HaKabbalah ein bahem machloikis la'olam. Divrei HaKabbalah, anything that we have halacha l'Moshe Misinai, there is no machloikis. The chol davar shetibatze me machloikis, anytime you find a machloikis in anything, biyodua she'ini kabbalah Moshe Rabbeinu, you know it's not something that we have in Messiah. Because anything that we have in Messiah, there can't be machloikis. It's a freak the Bir Halacha. How is it possible that the sheer sukkah is halacha l'Moshe Misinai? It's a machloikis. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai is the one that says Zayin al Zayin. Beis Hillel said it's vav vav vav. We grab the passing like Beis Shammai. But at the end of the day, it's a machloikis. If it's a machloikis, by definition, it can't be halacha l'Moshe Misinai. This is the Bir Halacha's kasha, and the Bir Halacha bleibt sarachim. So the truth is, we spoke about this in the past, recently in the end of Masechtas Yuma, but I think it's kedai to repeat. The Im Beis Medrash would add a very, very geschmack chiddush. And that is, there's a Gemara Masechtas Yuma daf Peyam at Aleph. The Gemara brings a brayso. Shiurim shal oinshin, halacha l'Moshe Misinai. The shiurim are all halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Acherim oimrim, others say, acherim is Rameir, beis dinoi shal yaivitz tikna. It's not halacha l'Moshe Misinai, but rather it comes from the bezdin of yaivitz. So what exactly is the bezdin of yaivitz? So the rest of the story is a Gemara Masechtas Temura, daf Tez Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara discusses that b'mei Evlei Shal Moshe, during the Avelos of Moshe, nishtakchu, there were many halachas that were forgotten. Shloishes alafim halachas. There's different gersois in the Gemara, but there were many halachas that were forgotten. B'mei Evlei Shal Moshe. Amar Rabbi Avo said that even though all these halachas were forgotten, afal pikein hechziron Asniel ben Kenaz mitoich popudloi. Asniel ben Kenaz, he was one of the shoftim. He was Beis Dinoi Shel Yaivitz. He was machzor these halachas. He brought these halachas back. So temporarily, these halachas had been forgotten. But at the same time, Asniel ben Kenaz came along and he brought these halachas back. So Pashup Shad, Rashi says that Beis Dinoi Shel Yaivitz Tiknu means it was the bezdin of Asniel ben Kenaz that brought all these halachas back. So again, we have a brayso. Shiurim Shel Oinshim, all the shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Acherim Oimrim, Rav Meir said, Beis Dina Shal Yavetz Tiknum. They're related to Asniel ben Kenaz. It's related to Beis Dina Shal Yavetz. Straight to Briskerov. I don't understand Pashup Shad in this brayso. The brayso seems to be saying there's a machloikis. What's the origin of shiurim? The Chachamim say, what's shiurim? They're halacha l'Moshe Misinai. What did Acherim say? They're related to the Beis Din of Yavetz, which means they were halachas l'Moshe Misinai. They were rather forgotten, and then Asniel ben Kenaz brought them back. But at the end of the day, what are they? They're halachas l'Moshe Misinai. So the Chachamim are saying shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Misinai. Acherim is saying it's halacha l'Moshe Misinai. So what are we arguing about? Said the Briskerov, Acherim is coming to be moisef the history. That's what Acherim is coming to be moisef. Acherim is coming to say that you should know there are halachas l'Moshe Misinai. But punkt, FYI, hashtag rest of the story. You want to know where these halachas were from? These were from the halachas that were forgotten in the Evlish Shal Moshe, and then Asniel ben Kenaz came and he brought these halachas back. I hear it's very nice. It's geschmack to know this, but it usually doesn't make it into a brayso. Certainly not a mishnah, but it certainly doesn't make this into a brayso. So why would the Tana of the brayso be willing to tell? Why doesn't seem like a necessary point? Meaning, at the end of the day, for Eikta Briskerot, what's the machloikas? The Chachamim say that Shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Acherim said they're halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Beis Dinai shel Yavitz Tiknun. I hear it. That's a little historical fun fact. But at the end of the day, if it's Beis Dinai shel Yavitz, it's Vaiter halacha l'Moshe Sinai. So what exactly is the machlokes? So the Brisker Rav said a davar nifla. Brisker Rav said, because the Rambam says, the Rambam that we just quoted, Divrei HaKabbalah ein behem machlokes. He can have machlokes by halacha l'Moshe Sinai. V'chol davar shetimotze behem machlokes. Anytime you find the machlokes, biyodua she'ein Kabbalah b'Moshe Rabbeinu. You know for sure that this is not Divrei Kabbalah. So the Brisker Rav said, it always bothered me, this Rambam. He says you find so many sugis in Shas where you find machlokes in halacha l'Moshe Sinai. How's that possible? How could you have a machlokes halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Brisker Rav's example is chatzi nezik tzroiris, above a kame example. That's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's a machlokes sunchus and the chacham. But there's many gemaras in Shas where there's a machlokes regarding halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Rambam said, Divrei Kabbalah ein behem machlokes li'olam. So Brisker Rav said a davar nifla. Brisker Rav said any halacha l'Moshe Sinai that we have been mesoira, that's Divrei Kabbalah, loitivatzim hem machlokes. But there were different halachas, 3,000, 1,700, different recitals in the Gemara of halachas that were forgotten. How do we have those halachas today? Mitoich pilpuloi shel Asniyah ben Kenaz. Asniyah ben Kenaz came with pilpul, he came with lumdis, he came with yud gam midah shatar nedrashis. He brought back those halachas. Said the Brisker Rav, what would be if somebody would argue today on the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz? What if somebody would dingzich, you have a kal v'chaymer, I have a pircha on your kal v'chaymer. You have a ma'atzad, I have a pircha on your ma'atzad. Right? What would be if somebody would come and he would frag up the pilpul, the lumdis of Asniyah ben Kenaz? The whole halacha l'Moshe Sinai would be gone. So this that we say, Divrei Kabbalah loitimatzeh behem machlokes, that's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai that we have in Messiah. It's not hinged on the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz. We have it in Messiah. You can't argue with it. A Messiah is a Messiah is a Messiah. It's impossible. So any sugi in Shas where there's a machlokes says around, I can guarantee you know it. Biyodua, 1,000,000%. It's not from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not halacha l'Moshe Sinai Moshe Rabbeinu. But what about the halachas that are totally in the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz? There's no reason you can't argue with the pilpul. And if you argue with the pilpul, now you could argue with the halacha. So the Brisker Rav said, Maran Agris, anytime you find in Shas where there was a machlokes in halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it's from the halachas that were from Asniyah ben Kenaz. It's from the halachas that were from Beis Dinai shel Yavitz. And the reason there's a machlokes is because the machlokes was in the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz, and therefore, by knocking and debating the pilpul, there was an ability to suddenly debate the halacha. In other words, the tzvei dinim in halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There are halacha l'Moshe Sinai that are divrei HaKabbalah, that we have in Messiah. And then the halachas from Moshe Sinai, that the halachas that were forgotten in Me'evle Shel Moshe, and this that we have it today, it's all adank, to use the right sprach, the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz. Said the Brisker Rav, that's the machlokes in this brayso in Yuma Daf Pei Amud Aleph. The brayso says shiurim shaloin. What's shiurim? Halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's a regular halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Acherim said, Beis Dinai shel Yavitz Tiknum. It's true, it's the same halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's halacha l'Moshe Sinai that came from the Beis Din of Yavitz, which Rashi says is who was Asniyah ben Kenaz. It's related to the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz. L'may nafkamina? Not a fun fact. It's not hashtag rest of the story. Then nafkaminas, could you argue? If it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, there can't be any machlokes. However, if it's Beis Dinai shel Yavitz Tiknum, even though it's halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it's possible to have machlokes. Says the Pri Megadim, coming full circle, that the sheer Zayin al Zayin of a sukkah is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Freik the Chafetz Chaim in his Be'er Halacha. How could it be? The Rambam says Divrei HaKabbalah loitimatzeh behem machlokes. How can it be? It's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The teretz is acherim oimrim Beis Dinai shel Yavitz Tiknum. And like the acherim, it comes out. It's true. It's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It's mitoich pilpuloi shel Asniyah ben Kenaz. So if it's mitoich pilpuloi shel Asniyah ben Kenaz, you can have machlokes even the shiurim, and that's why there could be a Beis Shammai that said Zayin al Zayin and Beis Sul that said vav vav vav. By the way, sukkah shigavoy l'mayim yasvam psula from Yehuda Machsher, and there's a Rebbe that holds dalad amos al dalad amos. That's where you can have a bunch of machlokes in now in the shir of a sukkah. Ayit shiurim are halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The teretz is, but it's mitoich pilpuloi shel Asniyah ben Kenaz. And if you can argue with the pilpul of Asniyah ben Kenaz, now it's suddenly possible to argue with the actual halacha l'Moshe Sinai. But just to end with one bomb kasha. And I saw this kasha in the Sfarim from the same Peteruf. And the history of this kasha is, it's brought down in the Sefer Yehoshua. So there's a Sefer that's called Sefer Yehoshua. Who is the Sefer Yehoshua? So his name was Rabbi Yeshua Heschel Babad, who's the Gaivid of Tarnopol. He was the Minchas Chinuch's grandfather. So he was the Minchas Chinuch Zayda. Lived in the 18th century, and he wrote a sefer called Sefer Yeshua. It's impossible to get. Happens to be right here. But this is the sefer is called Sefer Yeshua, and he brings a kasha that he heard from his shvager, who heard this kasha from Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. It's like a little bit of history here. This is history. So who was the shvager of the Sefer Yeshua? His name was Rabbi Itzchak Hamburger. Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Ish Horowitz. Rabbi Itzchak Hamburger. Rabbi Itzchak Hamburger was the Rav of Hamburg of the triple community, and he was one of the big rabbanim in Europe. He had two famous sons-in-law. He had one son-in-law was Rav Shalom Igra. Rav Shalom Igra was the Rav in Preshberg before the Chassam Sofer became Rav in Preshberg. In Yeshiva they say that when the Tzais wrote his Avnei Meluim, so he went to Rav Shalom Igra to show him Chelik Aleph of the Avnei Meluim, and when he was there, Rav Shalom Igra was Mechaber to Chelik Beis of the Avnei Meluim. But in Yeshiva law, Rav Shalom Igra, with all the Gedolim that we heard about in the 1700s and the 1800s, everyone came, no one came to Rav Shalom Igra. Yeshiva world, he was considered like the biggest guyan of that kufa. But Rav Shalom Igra was an Eidim by Rav Itzchak Hamburger. He had another Eidim whose name was Rabbi Yaakov Galanda. So we've spoken about Rabbi Yaakov Galanda. He was the son of the Noda Yehuda. So Noda Yehuda had a son whose name was Yaakovka. So Yaakovka was a businessman, but he was Torah v'Gdula b'makam echad. There's some tshuvas in Madura Tinyan of Noda Yehuda where Rabbi Yaakovka is writing tshuvas, and you get to see a little flash of his lumdus and of his brilliance. He was also a shtikl gvir, so he paid to print the Noda Yehuda. There's a lot of very interesting history about Yaakovka. But Yaakovka Landau, who was the Noda Yehuda's son, was also an Eidim by Rabbi Itzchak Hamburger, meaning he was a mechutim with the Noda Yehuda. But kids, so we worked this all out. The bottom line is that the Sefer Yeshua, Rabbi Yeshua Heschel Abad said, he writes in the Sefer, he says, I heard a kasha, my shvager told me that he met Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, and Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz asked him the following question. This was his question. The pasuk says in the beginning of Sefer Yeshua, so the real Sefer Yeshua, as in Yeshua ben Nun, not the Tarna Polaruf. So Sefer Yeshua, the pasuk says that when the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael the first year, they ate matzah. When they ate it, mimachras haPesach. Now just to frame it, the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael Yud Nisan. Moshe Rabbeinu was nifta Zayin Adar. There were 30 days of Avelis. That was right after the P'tir of Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? It's like hard to imagine. 40 years they were in the middle. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't going to attack. So Moshe Rabbeinu was nifta Avelis. They got up. They dusted themselves off, and they entered Eretz Yisrael. Moshe Meis, Yeshua Machnis. Take it from here. So the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael. So it says that when they entered Eretz Yisrael, they had a Prava Pesach. So they ate matzahs. But they ate matzahs mimochras haPesach, which the Gemara says means they didn't eat it on Pesach. They ate it the next day. Supposed to eat matzah Tes Vav Nisan. That's Pesach. They ate it on Tes Zayin Nisan. So Gemara says, why? Why did they eat it on Tes Zayin Nisan? Gemara says, very posh. Because when they came into Eretz Yisrael, all the wheat was chadash. They weren't allowed to eat from the wheat. They couldn't eat from the wheat because the wheat was chadash. They needed to bring the carbon omer to be matter the tfuah hachadasha. The carbon omer was brought on Tes Zayin Nisan. So they couldn't eat the wheat until they were makriv the carbon omer. So Tes Zayin Nisan, they brought the carbon omer, and then they took the wheat, they made matzahs, so they ate the matzahs, mimachras haPesach. Tosfos, in Masechtas Kedushin, Daf Lamed Chesam and Aleph, brings the Yerushalmi that asks a bomb kasha. And this Yerushalmi is like the foundation of so much raid. Great in Yerushalmi, I understand, why couldn't they eat the matzah? What's the problem? Chadash. Yavai asay the be'erev toichlu matzahs. Forget chalois asay the chadash. Chadash is a lois asay at the end of the day. Matzah is an asay. So let the asay of achilas matzah be doicha the lois asay of chadash. So Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, the Rebbe Rabbi Yonasan, he asked Rabbi Itzchak Hamburger, he says, I don't understand. It's before in the Gemara in Yuma, that Peyamid Aleph, that the shiurim were from the halachas that were forgotten, b'mei evloi shal Moshe. Beisdinoi shal yayvetz tiknum. Acherim oimrim. That's why you have machlokes when it comes to shiur. Because these halachas were forgotten. When were they returned? When did we get the shiurim back? Asniel ben Kenaz was machzeh the shiurim mitoich populoi. When the Yidden entered Eretz Yisrael, it was after the Yimei Evloi Shal Moshe. They had just forgotten thousands of halachas. They weren't going to get it back until Yaivitz's Bezdin. That was yet to come. It wasn't around yet. Yaivitz's Bezdin is going to come. But not yet. Which means at that time, they didn't know the Shiurim. Because the Shiurim were from the halachas that were forgotten. Yuma Dapayim and Aleph. That's the Briskerov. That's based in Shal Yavitz Tiknum. That means at that time they had no idea what the shir was. So maybe they knew a shtickle what the shir was, but they didn't know what the kazayas was, the chayra. They couldn't have known 100%. So if that's the case, how could they have eaten matzah shal chadash? What are you going to tell me? Let us say of matzah be doicha the lois say of chadash. If you know what the shir is, you know what a kazayas is, so you'll eat a kazayas, When you eat the kazayis, you make the mitzvah. You're over the lois naseh, or b'yovei aseh the matzah. If you eat lois naseh the chodesh. But what would happen if you eat 2 kazayis? The second kazayis, there's no mitzvah. The mitzvah is to eat 1 kazayis of matzah. The second kazayis, there's no mitzvah anymore. Chodesh, the isser is al kol kazayis or kazayis. How could they have eaten it? Maybe they're eating too much. It's impossible. They couldn't have done it. So it's Rabbi Yonasan asked Rabbi Yitzchak Hamburger, he says, how is it possible for the Yidden, what's the Yerushalmi's kasha? They should have eaten matzah shel chodosh, because I say if matzah could be doichel alav of chodosh, it wouldn't have been possible. Because when you say asay doichel lois asay, you can't do any more than the asay. It has to be punklach. So you have to do the asay, you do the lois asay, they knock each other out, and you're going to be fine. The problem over here is they didn't know what the shir was. How do you know they didn't know what the shir was? Because they forgot thousands of halachas we may have l'shel Moshe. One of those halachas was the shiurim. Yuma daf be'yam aleph. They would come back by Beis Din Shel Yavitz. That was in the future. This is during that kufa, that interim period where they don't know the shir. So when they sat down and they prab and they ate matzahs the next day, so they ate it. It's like this, they knew for sure they were yoitza. But right now we're playing with every little chatzi shir, because if you eat a drop more than a kazayas, you'll be over this a chodesh, and at the same time you're not going to be yoitza the mitzvah matzah. And if they didn't know what the shir was, it would have been impossible. Either way, this is the kasha. Yes.